Let's talk about the very important topic of stateful agents. In ACP, all the agents are stateless by default. When we say stateless, it means that the ACP has no history of previous interactions that you have had with the ACP server. For example, if your ACP agent uses a large language model, you will send a request as a prompt to the large language model and you get a response. The next time you send a prompt, the response is only about that prompt and has no relevance to the previous prompts that you have sent to the large language model. So if you want to have the conversation history, you need a stateful agent. Stateful agents can maintain the conversation history across multiple interactions. And stateful agents do it by maintaining a session object and a session ID. In the ACP SDK of Python, the session ID is session_ID. So if no session ID is provided when you run the agent, ACP SDK generates a session ID and includes it in the response so that in the next interactions with the agent, you can include that session ID. And using that session ID, the ACP server loads the previous conversation history. We need to make changes to both server and client that we have created so far. In the ACP client, use the session context manager to automatically maintain the session state. Let's go to Visual Studio and see this. Again, if you clone the GitHub repository of this course, under the directory called Stateful Agent, there is a client and a server. Let's look at the client first. So previously, we only created the client object and we put it in a variable called client. Now we need an instance of client session as well, and we put it in a variable, for example, called session. And then we use that session to run the agent. And we obviously pass the name of the agent and a message. So as you can see in this client, I'm running the agent twice. The first time I say, hello, my name is X. And then the second time I say a joke with my name in it. Now let's run this and see what happens. So as you can see, the LLM responded with, I would be happy to create a joke for you. Could you please tell me your name? That means that this first time that we ran the agent has no relevance to the second time, because if they were related, the LLM would have known my name. So we have fixed the client by basically using the session here and using the session to do the agent run, but our server needs improvement as well. Now let's see that what we need to do in the ACP server. So far, your ACP server function had one parameter as the input and its type was a message. If you want to create a stateful agent, you need to pass a second parameter and its type must be context. Context is a class in ACP SDK. That context will give you access to session, and using that session, you can load the previous conversation history and include it in the memory when you pass the request to large language model. Let's go to Visual Studio and see it. So this was our client. This is our server. As you can see, previously we only had this parameter of type message in our agent function. Now we pass a second parameter, and that second parameter's type is context. Context has to be loaded from ACP SDK server, the first line in this file. Now the two lines that are relevant to ACP SDK are these two lines. Let me just remove the comment. So as you can see, context has an attribute called session, and that has a method called load history, and it loads the history into a variable called history. If I hover the mouse, you will see that load history returns async iterator, and every item is of type message. Now we need to do an iteration in that in an async way and pull every single message in that list of messages and put it in another list like history message here. These two lines are relevant to ACP SDK. These two lines here, let me untoggle them. They are not related to ACP SDK. These are framework specific. So I'm using BAI framework. So these two lines are relevant to BAI framework. If you are using LangChain or other frameworks, you must use the SDK relevant to your framework. So what happens here is that I'm converting the SDK messages here to a framework specific type of message. That's all I'm doing here. Because ACP SDK is independent of your large language model framework. That is why we do this. So regardless of what framework you use, you have to convert your ACP message history into framework message history and then add it to your memory. Now you understand why we created this React agent here. We created a memory and then passed it to React agent here to be able to communicate with the LLM, and that is why we did that. Now we can load the message history into memory. And then when we do agent run, the LLM will have a memory of previous conversations, and therefore it will return a response that has basically relevance to what we have said before. Let's run the server. Let's go to client and run the client. So previously the response was that, could you please tell me your name? Now let's clear the screen and run the client again. This time, as you can see, LLM said a joke and included my name in the joke. And that means that the first time when I said, hello, my name is Arif, it understood it and kept it in the memory. And then second time when I said, say a joke with my name in it, because we loaded the previous conversation into memory and then passed it to LLM, it had an idea about my name and said a joke with my name in it.